we send our condolences, and we believe that in the near future, we shall be getting out of this pandemic. We note that in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, the need for many countries to raise government revenue has become more pressing as we see countries trying to improve fiscal sustainability, trying to promote equity and avoid the adverse effects of COVID-19. We've seen a number of countries coming up with new tax instruments. Some are regressive in nature, but also we note that there are new debt instruments that come along, financing instruments. So today's
Hello, Regina, you're mute.
Okay, thank you, perfect. Today, we are organizing an online policy dialogue on the surge in market financing instruments and the fiscal implications for the East African community. What does this mean? I know the panelists will be talking about this because they have more expertise and they are well knowledgeable in all these issues. We have co-organized this dialogue in partnership with AFRODAD, Uganda Debt Network, Transparency International Kenya, and Tanzania Coalition on Data and Development. And we believe that by the end of the 2-hour discussion, we shall sort of understand more, have an in-depth market finance instruments mean for East Africa, what are the opportunities and what are the challenges. We do have also a representative from the IMF, that is a Uganda representative. She'll be speaking shortly. And without wasting a lot of time, I'll be inviting the SEATINI Executive Director, that is Ms. Jane Nalunga. I'll just read briefly her profile. I know it's a lot, she has done a lot. She's an expert on trade and tax and investment issues in general, and at the multilateral, bilateral, regional, and national trade and investment policies and agreements in particular. She has more than 20 years experience in policy research, analysis, and advocacy, and has authored a number of policy-oriented studies and articles. She sits on a number of national policy-making bodies, advises government and parliament on trade, tax, and investment issues. So, Ms. Jane Nalunga, over to you to officially open the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina, for those kind words, for the kind introduction. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen, who are on this policy dialogue, participating in this policy dialogue. I'm going to ask that I remove my, I switch off my video because my connection is a little bit weak. I'm going to give a very short opening remarks on behalf of the organizers of this dialogue, who are AFRODAD, Transparency International Kenya, Tanzania Coalition on Data and Development, SEATINI Uganda, and the support of this dialogue, Diaconia. So I would like to welcome all of you on their behalf to this very important policy dialogue. Comrades, we are living in very unprecedented times on a number of fronts. The first front, as you know, and as Regina has pointed out, is the COVID pandemic and its resultant crises the health, the economic, the development crisis. Another unprecedented times, the other front, is the issue of resource mobilization. As Regina has pointed out, because the economy has contracted, there is a challenge when it comes to domestic resource mobilization. Another unprecedented challenge is the issue of funding. You know, we have realized that there is a drop in concessional lending from our traditional funders. Those are the multilateral institutions. And we have seen that because of that drop, we have seen government looking elsewhere to get resources to address the resultant crises as a result of the pandemic. So why we are here is to look at those new ways, those financing instruments that government has turned to. As you know, these include the PPPs, the Eurobonds, the treasury bills, the bonds, you know, and some of us will have just been hearing about these instruments, the Eurobonds, because what I know is that Kenya has already used some of these instruments, the Eurobonds. So what we want to know today, to understand, you know, have a deep understanding of these financing instruments. What do they mean? You know, what are they? What do they mean for our countries? What do they mean, you know, for when it comes to budgets, when it comes to tax? What do they mean for our domestic resource mobilization? The organizers of this meeting are from the region, the East African region, and I applaud them for coming together to organize this policy dialogue, because it's very, very important that we look at this issue regionally, you know. Like the saying goes, if we are together, we are stronger. So we need to have a regional approach when it comes to the debt issue. This issue, this policy dialogue comes at a very, very timely occasion when we are, all of us in the region have started on our new budget and tax cycle. But most importantly also is the fact that the debt issue is the elephant in all our rooms. You know, we have to address the debt issue before it gets out of hand. So for me, I think it's important that this dialogue has been organized, that we understand these issues so that we can be able to engage the government officials, engage our partners, IMF and World Bank, and other creditors, engage Parliament from an informed point of view. So let us learn, let us listen, let us also strategize clearly the way forward on how we are going to engage those other partners on this issue. So with those few words, I wish all of us a fruitful deliberation. Let us be active. Those who have information, please share that information, because it's basically a learning process. It's a process where we can be able to learn more and also strategize for engagement. Thank you so much, all the participants, and wish you all a fruitful deliberation. Thank you. Over to you, Regina.
Thank you, Jane, for the opening remarks. I think the key takeaway is the need for us to understand the instruments more That's the fact that if we are together, we are stronger. It's no wonder that we brought on board AFRODAD to share with us their perspective on, they'll be making a presentation on the various market financing instruments and the drivers behind their adoption by government. We do have Adrian Chikowore, who is on board, and he works with the African Forum on Data and Development. He is the policy and research consultant and the head in the international public finance portfolio at AFRODAD, who is responsible for providing technical policy advice on development finance policy and development effectiveness in Africa. His work streams include aid and development, emerging lenders, PPPs, and publicly supported private finance. He holds a Master of Science degree in African Studies from the University of Edinburgh and a number of other related courses that he has done. Adrian, over to you. I don't know if you can share your screen.
All right, thank you, Regina.
If you have any questions, please share them in the chat. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Regina. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for that, for the introduction, and thank you to Jane for giving us opening remarks that pretty much give us the scope for the discussion that we shall be having today. I shall be presenting a presentation focusing on market financing instruments and fiscal implications for the East African community region. And this presentation will be focusing on PPPs and bonds largely. For the sake of bandwidth, I think you would allow me to turn off or switch off my video so that I proceed. All right, so the outline of the presentation basically starts with defining PPPs as well as bonds in different sections. And then it also delve on the model of PPPs as well as the rationale and impacts of PPPs and bonds. And then lastly, I shall proffer some recommendations that we have come up with through a number of studies, conferences, and advocacy initiatives. So to start with, I'm going to start with the PPP aspect of financing, per se. So PPPs, according to the Institute of PPPs, as well as the World Bank, are a form of legally enforceable contract between the public sector and private sector, whereby there is the requirement of new investments, where the private sector provides funds, technology, expertise, and time, as well as reputation. And within this form of a contract, there is the transfer of key risks to both the private sector and the public sector, with the private sector usually undertaking risks, including the design, construction, and operation, whilst the public sector gets to actually take a lot of risks, political, economic, you name it. However, this is more of a complex introduction, but however, with our partners, EuroDAD, LatinDAD, AsiaDAD, we just refer PPPs as long-term contractual arrangements where the private sector provides infrastructure and services that have traditionally been provided by the public sector. And these include infrastructure for sectors such as health, which are hospitals, clinics, for education, that could be schools, for transport infrastructure, roads, rails, as well as for water and sanitation. So for a lot of us who have read about PPPs, when someone talks about PPPs, they think it's that one kind of framework that everyone just refers to as if they are just talking about bread. But PPPs do have quite a number of models. And here on my screen, you might be seeing that there are what we call service contracts, where usually they support infrastructure services such as billing, where private sector risk is usually low, contract length ranging between 1 and 3 years, and then capital investment and ownership being public. The common sectors usually are water utilities and railways, and usually governments provide the sectoral planning and regulate services. There are also those that are called management contracts, where basically you would you would see the management of a part or all of the operations by the private sector, where the private sector risk could be low to medium, but usually on the part of government, you see some surmountable form of risk. And common sectors are usually water and utilities. However, the common types that we have come across or gotten to know are the build, own, transfer kind of contracts, where the contract purpose basically is for the investment in and operation of specific components of infrastructure services. Risks in terms for government as well as private sector could be high, basically because of the nature of the infrastructure development. Usually these are big or mega infrastructure developments. And you'd realize that the common sectors are energy sectors, the transport sectors, where highways and rails are being developed. And here you see a lot of the SGRs, the gingers being part of this kind of a contract. There is also a common term that has been seen as rising, which is that of privatization. The privatization of services, including health, education, telecoms, is something that we've been seeing in East Africa as a result of a number of reasons that our African governments in East Africa, as well as the broader African continent, have been transferring ownership of public infrastructure to the private sector. And in terms of contract length, we've heard about the 18s to the 30 years, but mostly this is indefinite because it is also based upon how governments get to repay the loans that they would have accrued for the development of the infrastructure. And then I think you could be asking why PPPs? What's the rationale behind the adoption of PPPs in East Africa, as well as the African continent in general? And I think Madam Jane had highlighted one or two of them, and one being the limited fiscal space for governments to meet development needs. I think we would understand the infrastructure needs within the East Africa region does not speak to what government budgets provide in terms of infrastructure for health. We do have dilapidated health facilities, dilapidating road networks. Thus, PPPs are being adopted so that they address this challenge. There is also another notion that pro-PPP proponents highlight when they say, why are we adopting PPPs? And one is low public sector capacity to increase the level of investment to meet increasing development needs. And this lack of capacity could be in various ways, one being the human resources. There are arguments that public officials within our government ministries across the sectors have limited capacity to understand or even engage in the implementation of PPP projects as compared to those that manage projects from within the private sector. And this has been one of the issues there. And the capacity issue also speaks to the limited fiscal space that I've highlighted. There is also a notion that is say that private sector offers greater efficiency in project execution and service delivery. And I think we are alive to this reality that in some projects that we've seen the public solely undertaking a project, there could be delays amongst other things, and there is the misuse of funds, corruption being part of that as well. And this has been one of the reasons that pro-PPP proponents highlight, and they even highlight that private sector comes up with quality deliverables in an efficient manner at low cost. But this is something that we'll delve in with the case studies that we have, that I've drafted in the following slides. And then when I talked about the low cost, I think there is also that issue of the fact that PPP proponents highlight that PPPs tend to offer better value for money, the low cost with efficient delivery for quality outputs, rather. That's basically the argument that is there. But as I've been speaking, you might be wondering, who are the proponents that I've just been talking about? I was saying the proponents, but here we have quite powerful actors who actually control the global financial architecture. And here I'm talking about the European Union, which comes to Africa through the AU-EU partnership and other initiatives such as Team Europe, amongst others. So the G20 also being part also of the actors. These institutions have been pushing for private sector participation within development. And one of the main instruments they've been using is PPPs within their various forms and formats. The World Bank Group is also a key actor within pushing for PPPs globally. They have what they call the maximizing financing for development. And this concept really speaks about the lack of or the inadequate financing that the global south has or is characterized by. Thus, there is a need to engage private sector, mainly from the global north, to engage in development projects for development outputs, rather. And they have pushed also for a position on blending, giving reasons or being alive to the reality that official development assistance, which is aid, has been dwindling over the years. I think at the Monterrey Consensus in the early 2000s, the OECD countries, as well as most countries in the global north, committed to financing the global south through aid to the tune of 0.7 of GNI. And since then, they've only managed to push to around 0.7, but over the past 2 decades, it has been 0.3, amounting to around 44 billion for the African continent on average over the past 2 decades. And then also you see the United Nations system as a whole through the financing for development or the SD agenda. If we are to look at the Nairobi outcome document, then paragraphs 30, 36, and 48 speak to the need of having all players come in the financing of the SDGs. And this is not a bad thing. However, there aren't adequate checks and balances as to the implications of private sector financing when it comes then to financing SDG targets, either on education, health, climate change, infrastructure development, or even inequality as well. So these institutions at the higher level have actually been critical in pushing for PPPs. I wouldn't have done justice if I don't talk about the Chinese overseas investments. They are coming in various ways. We could say PPPs as public-private partnerships, or PPPs in the form of public-public partnerships, because a number of investments are coming through bilateral investment agreements between China and African countries within East Africa, as well as the African continent as it is. So here you see the FOCAC being a critical platform where financing is channeled to the African continent and mostly East Africa. I think we have seen quite a number of infrastructure developments being spearheaded through Chinese financing, through the China Exim or Chinese Development Bank. So basically you see China as part of the matrix when we're talking about PPPs. And these institutions have then influenced how the African continent and the various regions then adopt private sector financing or PPPs within their policy frameworks. And here, if you see, if you look at the African Union's Agenda 2063, in its 10-year resource mobilization strategy, you hear the document speaking about at least 10 to 30% having to be external financing in the form of ODA, official development assistance, foreign direct investments, as well as PPPs in that matrix. And then around 60% having to be domestic. But an introspection into this, we realize that it's actually the flip side. We're seeing more of external resources coming into the regions, SADC, EAC, ECOWAS, as compared to domestic resources mobilization, though it is picking up, but it has taken a tortoise steps when it comes to financing for our own development. So you see this now in the regional protocols of the EAC, the investment protocols, and thereby seeing how we've started adopting PPPs. You also then see this in the various national development plans, Vision 50s, the Vision 2030s, the national development strategies within the countries within East Africa now speak to PPPs. And this has been one of the reasons. So when we're talking about PPPs in general, they have had positive and negative impacts per se, but you realize the financing is coming and it is direly needed. That's one thing for sure. However, the implications are wide-ranging, both focusing on the fiscal, social, and then economic aspect of things. And one thing you see is higher user fees and out-of-pocket expenses for public goods. And this, you probably see it more in health and education PPPs, where when you are supposed to visit a clinic, then you're supposed to pay some money out of your pocket to have a service delivered to you. And then you also limited access to services by ordinary citizens. And this basically speaks to the inequality that with PPPs, you also get some facilities being more expensive than public services, thereby actually disenfranchising some sections of the populations from accessing either rights-based services. You also see the commodification of public goods. You see this mostly in education, health, social protection systems as well, where public goods are now being sold to the public and they become a market-based service delivery. More so, you see also that PPPs undermine democratic accountability, and usually you see this in corruption, especially in tendering systems or tendering processes, and the non-solicitation of some bids. I think even the World Bank has highlighted some of this, and I think if you are to look at the Lubova Hospital in Uganda, you see there were some aspects where the PPP Act was not, processes were not duly followed, and these are some of the undertones that come with PPPs. One stark highlight that we've seen with PPPs is how they undermine parliamentarians' oversight role. And this is because of the influence of private sector on the executive, usually the cabinet as well as the president's office. PPPs operate at that higher level if they are not properly, if processes are not properly followed, and you see parliamentarians being sidelined and losing control over loans for PPPs or contracts for PPPs. So as an example, I think most of us in East Africa are accustomed to Kenya Standard Gauge Railway, the SGR, which the government of Kenya procured in 2014, rather. So for the SGR, there was a concession agreement with the China Exim Bank, where there was the need to design, build, finance, and operate and transfer the infrastructure. The project was built at around 3.8 billion US dollars, and the Exim Bank extended 90% debt loan, and and 10% was being provided by the Kenyan government. However, my dates could be outdated, but as at June 2020, the National Treasury was seeking at least 940 million US dollars in interest and principal installments to pay off the Chinese government, the Chinese Exim Bank, as well as the CDB, the Chinese Development Bank. And additionally, the government would need $380 million in accumulated bills owed to Africa Star Railway Operation Company, which is the special purpose vehicle that would be operating the railway line. However, priorities are also of concern when engaging to PPPs. Here, from my understanding, the SGR does not generate enough to cover its operational costs. And then if you compare to the needs of the country in terms of housing, in terms of health, you'd realize that these are more pressing issues than having the SGR per se. So yeah, this is one case that I could pick there. And then for Uganda, I'm accustomed to the Lubova Hospital, where owing to the challenges faced in Uganda's health sector, the government of Uganda approved promissory notes of at least 379 million in partnership with Finance Roko, a special purpose vehicle to develop or deliver this specialized medical facility. But there were a couple of challenges with this, with the inception of this project, because one, the loan approval process was skewed. It did not follow what is set within the PPP Act of 2015. And then in terms of value for money, at its inception, it was initially costed 345 million, and 249 would be for construction, 95 million would be for the cost of financing. But there were revisions that were made, and it ended up being a 557 million project. And these are some of the fiscal implications then, because the government still has to pay back that money, and it is paying it from the taxpayers' contributions, thereby limiting or inhibiting some developments on other critical sectors. And I could talk about the implications of health in as much as the hospital has not really gone off. I think as of May 2021, it was still at foundation level. But from the time its inception, the government had to start making payments for the next 8 years. And if you compare this with the health budget, then you realize, plus the interest rather, you then realize that the government has been failing to meet the Abuja declarations 15% towards health. For financial year 2018-2019, the budget for health was 9.2, but it has been dwindling. 2019-2020, 7.9%, and then 2020-21, it's around 5.1%, thereby highlighting how PPPs could stifle other sectors as a result of the structure of the repayment plans. I wouldn't have done much justice if I don't talk about the COVID-19 and how private sector instruments have been playing out. I think we have seen a systematic shift from aid for humanitarian crisis to loans. And here I'll talk probably about the various credit facilities via international financial institutions that have been put across. I think the IMF, the AFDB have availed rapid credit facilities for the COVID recovery or tackling the COVID effects. But these are coming as loans, in as much as they could be zero interest or low interest loans. The implication now on debt is the fact that we are continuing to increase the debt stocks on the countries. And this is not only for East Africa, but the African continent, most countries in the global south. We also saw the role of the Global Alliance for Vaccine, the Gavi, as well as the International Financing Facility for Immunization. They pretty much prioritize the role of private sector for the delivery of vaccines, amongst other things. And this is basically because that's where the financing is. But what are the implications, both social, economic, even political, as well as fiscal? You then see how big pharmacies were hoarding vaccines, or rather global north countries hoarding vaccines for the global north, thereby causing a vaccine nationalism. I think at some point the African continent only had probably 10% of vaccines that had already been produced in the world around the beginning of the year. But we were in dire need of vaccines, but we couldn't get them. However, I think we have come to realize the role of the DSSI and the special drawing rights that were availed just in the last month. And this could be a good opportunity to then relook how we finance our development. So I think for this, I'll pack it, but then it is also important to note that these private sector instruments are actually contributing to the new wave of indebtedness that the African continent, the East Africa region, is facing per se. I think for the East and partly the Horn of Africa, we see some countries such as Somalia, Somaliland, actually being in debt distress. You see Kenya, Ethiopia in high risk of debt distress. And then countries such as Uganda could have been low as it's 2020, but I'm sure they're now moving towards moderate risk and probably possibly high risk because of the data discrepancies on debt stocks across a number of countries within the East Africa region as well as the African continent. With this, I think I'll move to bonds and I'll briefly look at them, what they are, why governments are adopting or issuing bonds, as well as some of the risks that are attached to them. So a bond in general terms and in simple terms is a loan from an investor to a borrower, such as a company or government, and the borrower uses the money to fund their operations, whilst the investor receives interest on the investment. So I think it is just important to highlight that the market value of a bond can change over time, and this could have effects on the fiscal position of the borrower, country or entity. But however, why are countries issuing bonds? I think similar to PPPs, the issue of African countries are being cash-strapped, thereby having to borrow money on the international private markets, has been one reason why we see countries within the East Africa region, Kenya to be precise, turning to Eurobonds as an instrument of choice to finance infrastructure, including even climate resilience. We also see a rise in the issuance of green bonds, but mainly through the World Bank system. Some reasons behind the surge in borrowing and bond issuances by African countries, as according to the IMF, I think it's the 2020 publication that I quoted, talks about the changes in institutional environments, such as more flexibility for income countries with access to non-concessional borrowing, reduced debt burdens for some countries, but largely this has been the borrowing needs for countries are actually large, and bond issuances come with fewer strings attached than money from or funds from multilateral institutions such as the World Bank Group, which come with quite a number of structural adjustment requirements. More so, bonds in the context of Eurobonds have given African countries an opportunity to integrate into global financial markets, and this integration has been important to some countries, but then there could be, or there are actually some implications for that, especially if there are to be recessions. You'd see how that then plays out with with the bond markets as well. And then also bonds also help reduce budgetary deficits in an environment in which donors are no longer willing to increase grants per se. So if we were to look at the trends of bond issuances over the past decade, you'd realize that around 2009, we're just talking around 2 to 3 billion, with increases mainly seen around 2017, where we're talking about 17, 18 billion. 2018, actually, we almost topped, the African continent almost topped around 30 billion. But yeah, this has dropped a bit as at 2020, we're back down, and this is probably also linked to the COVID pandemic as well. for countries now, you see quite a number of countries, South Africa, Egypt, though not in the East Africa region, topping outstanding Eurobonds as of 2019. This could be pretty much the same, though with some minute changes as per 2020. But for countries in the East Africa region, you see Kenya having outstanding Eurobonds to the tune of 4.8 billion. You see Ethiopia at $1 billion, you see Rwanda at around 400 million, Tanzania at 200 million. And these are some of the trends that we are seeing, but then the implications now when it comes to repayment and how that affects budgetary processes, then you realize how the debt issue then comes into play as a result of Euro bonds in general. And these are some of the risks. One being repayment is at maturity and not amortized. And this basically means the practice of spreading an intangible assets over its useful life won't be in retrospect there. Bonds are usually denominated in international currencies such as the US dollar. And there is a foreign exchange risks where any forms of devaluation could generate more debt for a country holding or that is issued bonds. Interest rates have a tendency of changing, especially with the volatility that we face in African markets, and this could increase the cost of debt as well. And then one critical issue is the fact that bonds are more difficult to restructure due to the number of creditors involved in a bond deal. And yeah, this is where you see then quite a number of issues when it comes to how countries have to repay loans, especially in a context where it is difficult to restructure or to defer loans to a later stage. Political and economic instability, I think this is something that I've spoken about as well, that the political and economic standing of a country also affects how a bond then delivers the required output for a country. Should there be instability, it would be risky economically for a country as a result of interest. So as I move to finish my presentation, I think when it comes to recommendations, AFRODAD is largely guided by the AFRODAD's African Borrowing Charter, where it aims to promote sustainably balanced debt levels with the necessity to accelerate inclusive development and hence public service delivery in Africa. The Borrowing Charter also aims at contributing towards improvement in transparency of political, institutional, administrative processes used in loan construction. But more recently, in the last month, AFRODAD convened the African Conference on Debt and Development, where we came up with the Harare Declaration. And it has sections where there are observations and clarion calls on debt management. And I think observation 8 speaks largely to the instruments that actually on the stage, the PPPs, the bonds, the T-bills. And here we highlight how unfair the global financial architecture is towards the global south, where there is still the remnants of a colonial history in terms of financial markets and how the financial instruments are controlled by the global north to keep African countries in check. And this system has been skewed. Thus, you have seen the systemic shift from aid to loans or less concessional loans that then keep African countries rooted in the vicious circle of debt. And this is something that we're trying to advocate against so that there is the reform of the global financial architecture. So in recommendations for East African countries on PPPs and bonds, I think one key issue is to ensure that there is a clear rationale to engage private instruments across any sector, thereby promoting responsible borrowing as well as responsible loan construction. when engaging in PPPs and bonds, I believe government should ensure that they do due diligence to evaluate the merits and demerits to such ventures, because besides the financial cost, there should be an assessment of the capacity of the government itself, as well as the economy to pay for services that the loans would have brought by. And then over and above, I think the government in EAC should develop and implement clear policies on loan contraction that promote the role of parliaments as effective oversight bodies. So I think with this, I'll pack it here, and I would like to thank you for giving me an ear on that, and possibly I would welcome questions as well as discussions on this. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrian, for the broader perspective. Helped us to understand what makes him. You did emphasize that we have positive impacts and negative impacts, and our role as civil society is to see how we maximize the positives that come with the instruments, but also trying to address some of the challenges. I know we have a team of experts that have been that are lined up, so I would not want to delve into the discussion to preempt what they want to say, but I could as well note from the chat, there are a few comments that came through, especially from, just give me a minute, from had one from Michael Fred. He was appreciating I think that's one of the slides on PPPs that have negatively affected GRPS, especially health, education, which majorly impacts on the poor. And as well as the women, children, and the most marginalized populations. The Abjan principles elaborates on what should be and should not be done. Maria, we have a comment from Maria. This is a brilliant slide. I think it's not the same. So it's so clear that the push for PPPs and privatization in general is not based on evidence, but on ideology. The negative impact of PPPs tend to outweigh the positive impact, especially in the medium to long term. You can keep the comments coming through as we are listening to our next panelist, who is Irene Boke, and she works with Transparency International Kenya, based in Kenya, ideally. Irene, over to you. Please share your perspective on the presentation and maybe any work that you've done on it. Thank you. You have about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Regina. And thank you to SEATINI for organizing this very important dialogue. And my name is Irene Boke Mwita. I work at Transparency International Kenya as the Deputy Program Officer under a program called Social Justice and Economic Accountability. So social justice and economic accountability, like the name suggests, we simply look at issues of social justice, historical injustices, as well as a focus on economic accountability, where now my focus on this dialogue will be, or discussion on this dialogue will be based. So I had prepared a few slides, but with Adrian's excellent presentation, I don't see the need to go into them. I'll just highlight a few things, maybe perhaps in addition, and my presentation will be basically focused on Kenya, given the context. But like Adrian had said, how PPPs, allow me to begin with PPPs, how they simply arise or come about. And for Kenya, I know there is a big push for Vision 2030, the blueprint for economic or industrialization of Kenya into a middle-income economy by the year 2030. And this is basically how initially, or the push for PPPs actually came about. But the policy statement or the policy statement putting this into effect was initially brought about in 2011. In 2011, but we also have Public-Private Partnerships Act of 2013 and a few regulations, one in 2014 and the other one in 2017. So Regina, I don't know if I can just share one single slide just to show the sectors, at least in the Kenyan perspective. Yeah, I think that's okay. Yeah, at least in the Kenyan perspective, if you see how, or the sectors that are predominantly, or PPPs are predominant in most sectors will be transport and infrastructure, and then we have education, we have a bit in the health sector. But agriculture, livestock, and fisheries has the least private public PPPs in place, at least in the Kenyan context. And I know Adrian talked about the SGR. Yeah, the SGR has been a big issue in Kenya, and especially the fact that it cannot generate enough income to repay or to settle the loan, but also another very heavy investment infrastructure that is currently ongoing in Kenya is the Nairobi Expressway. So they're building an expressway from within a certain distance here in Nairobi, and that is also through a private-public partnership. But I foresee a bit of challenges like we have had within the SGR. First, we look at the tax implications. Some of the disadvantages that I see will be tax implications of motorists, because for PPPs, as Adrian has explained, it's a private company maybe coming together with a government or institution or entity to form, to have an infrastructure, to build an infrastructure. It could be in the health sector, hospital, or education, could be hostels. We have a number of hostels built through the same infrastructure, the same arrangement. But now the private entity will derive its payments of the investment through now the project that they have built. So in this case, the expressway, probably I'm looking at maybe they will have a toll-free toll centers within the expressway where motorists will have to pay to be able to use the way. So I'm thinking, what are some of the costs? How much? Who will dictate the cost? Because we've seen the capacity, then the government, in most cases, it's the private entity that has the capacity to actually even set the prices. Government does not have really, because of the minimal understanding of the sector, then they might not be able to set the prices accordingly, or even do maybe an analysis of the prices set. So what are some of the implications in terms of cost and also taxation that will be implied, that will be catered for by motorists when using such infrastructures that have been built by through the same procedure or arrangement of PPPs. But also I see another challenge that I had highlighted. I can stop sharing that now. Yeah, another challenge that I foresee or thought is a big challenge when we are dealing with public-private partnerships is the issue of corruption, and especially when you're doing procurement. So some of these areas or expertise that we need are quite rare, for one, and then maybe the big bidding companies or the bidding private sectors are not as much. So there is that lack of competition in the first place. And I know Adrian had talked about value for money, or that we get better value for money in this. But if we are then going to pay a bigger price for that, then how does that value for money apply? You can get the project, yes, but you pay a lot for it simply because the processes of procuring the bidder were not really competitive as well as much. much. So that is a challenge that I think we can be able to discuss and just look at even the expertise within our different governments, just consider some of those challenges as we are procuring agreements within this framework. But also I've talked about lack of competition and also cost, because under PPPs, the private entity gives them much money within that infrastructure project, then they bear the biggest risk. So if they bear the biggest risk, then it's only right that they charge sufficient money to get for that risk. So the cost of this arrangement is definitely is likely to go higher, not definitely, likely to go higher. And then that will then follow up as how does it affect government revenue? How does it affect citizens or the taxation mechanisms that we have within our different countries? But also one issue that I think has been a bit highlighted within the SGR, the Standard Gauge Railway project, is the sovereignty of a country's infrastructure. Because, you have this infrastructure that was built by a Chinese institution. At least the majority of funding came from Exim Bank. But now they have to control, at least to get their dues for a certain period of time. Then what does that say about the infrastructure, the sovereignty of a country? And on key issues like when you're talking about ports, the port authorities or the different ports that we have within a country, or even the railways, as well as the airlines. If we have PPPs in such key areas or aspects of a country, then how does that influence or affect the sovereignty of a country? To maximize the time that I was given, allow me to just skip to Eurobonds very quickly. And I don't have much to add on this. Only that, Kenya will have the highest, I think, Eurobonds in East Africa. We have procured the highest Eurobond in East Africa. And as Adrian just said, the difficulties in structuring. Right now, we are looking at the third Eurobond in Kenya. And I think it was in April, the National Treasury was looking for experts to help in structuring this Eurobond. But some of the things that we have noted, even in the first Eurobond and the second Eurobond, the consistent thing that keeps coming up is the issue of corruption and misuse of these Eurobonds, and also lack of transparency and accountability. I know the Auditor General, I think in 2016 or 17, audited the 2014 Eurobond that we got, the first Eurobond, and there were a number of issues that came out. Utilization of the funds, where were the amounts that were allocated to different, maybe Ministry of Energy. Most of that amount was never discovered how it was utilized, and also a lot of amounts within that was procured within the Eurobond, the first Eurobond, were utilized outside the integrated financial management systems that we have. Then in that case, accountability is really limited, because you cannot tell that this person actually borrowed this amount from this fund and this is how they've used it. So transparency and accountability are issues that we really need to consider and interrogate further as we're looking at some of these finance market instruments that we are procuring. And very quickly, if time will allow, Regina, I can very slightly talk about domestic debt. We've seen, let me just share another slide here in the Kenyan context. In Kenya, we've seen a rise in, I'm struggling with this. Let me try once again. Yeah, we've seen a rise in domestic borrowing by government. And I think sometimes I find it difficult to gauge whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. But looking at some of the disadvantages of domestic borrowing, this slide, let me minimize that. This slide is just of this year, how domestic debt has increased or changed in the past, I think, few months in Kenya. So if you look at the total figure at the last column here, you'll see that the amount sort of increases with each month, except the month of March and I think January. I think the years should be 2020 going down, yeah. So the amount keeps increasing. Then you wonder, then what does this mean for private businesses? One, two, for small and medium enterprises, that are still struggling with just raising capital, and they have to get funding from governments from banks to be able to sustain their businesses. So there is the crowding out effect. There's possibility that domestic debt will definitely push out the small enterprises and the private institutions that are seeking loans from the bank. But also, what does this say about government or bank interest? How is that going to change over a period of time? Right now in Kenya, we have a budget of about 3 trillion. From that, our revenue is about 1 point something. And then we have a lot of that amount coming from our borrowing or debts. A bit of it is going to be financed by foreign debt, but majority of that amount should come from domestic debt or debt that is procured domestically. Then how are institutions, private institutions, or even small and medium enterprises, which are very, very key sector when you're talking about revenue raising and taxation, because they employ the majority of informal laborers or informal workers whose tax impact is larger than a lot of other institutions. Then how will that affect these SMEs or small medium enterprises? But also when you're talking about the bank rate, because remember, for governments, whenever they borrow, the first or the consolidated, that amount is repaid out of the consolidated fund support. So that means that it will be the amount that was once government has collected its revenue, then debt is the first thing that they pay out of that revenue, so that they can do other things. So budget for the service delivery, including health and education. So in that case, that there is sort of a guarantee that for the bank, at least the security, government security one is high. Two, because of the repayment method, then it's a guarantee that government will definitely pay. So banks will be more likely to give loans to government as opposed to individuals. One, your security is weak or low. Two, something might happen, COVID might happen or might persist. And you might not be able to actually then the bank will end up losing, you see. So there are a number of issues that I think we can interrogate, Regina, and as we move forward, I think the key thing for me would be just to know, or even to make recommendations for some of these key marketing financial instruments that we're using, or just how then do you even consider, how do you even monitor? Is there a place for civil society institutions to monitor some of this implementation or use of market instruments, or is it a preserve of only the government? How can citizens have their voice in this? When you're talking about public debt and how procuring of debt, then how do citizens have a voice in such instances? But key for me, and I'm sure my institution would be, how then, what are some of the transparency and accountability measures that have been put in place by government or even the financing institution, just to ensure, the amount that is being procured or given to the different government entities, then it's used, according to the plan, it's transparent, and the government can actually be able to account for some of these, for most, actually all, not most. It's time that we demand accountability for all our resources. That is the only way then we'll be able to domestically, harness every single resource that we have. Nothing is close to corruption or wastage. Issues of illicit financial flows, we see loopholes for leakages, such leakages, so that we can be able to depend on ourselves as a regional economic bloc and at large as Africa. So I think, Regina, that is it for me. I hope I was within the 10 minutes window, but I'm happy to also discuss further in the plenary. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene, for bringing the other angle on, of course, looking at the challenges in procurement, issues around sovereignty, as well as transparency and accountability, and of course the issue around domestic borrowing. And I think in this dialogue we could think through further on how to come up with more strategies on how our SMEs can all benefit from these strategies, as well as maybe the key question that you highlighted on how citizens or civil society organizations can ably engage in all these processes. How do we monitor, or is it a preserve to government. And maybe later on I'll be calling on Ms. Izabela to share with us some insights in that perspective. Before Hilda comes in, I would want to call on board Adrian, maybe to share, to respond to Maria's concern or question on whether we've taken into account the legal costs associated to PPPs contracts going wrong. I think the hospital in Uganda was one of them. That was one of the comments that was shared. Over to you, Adrian.
All right, thanks for that. And thanks, Maria, for that question. So you see with the legal costs, I think here we can also talk about investor-state disputes. And these have been quite problematic for countries. But then it takes someone who's in the field to actually follow up on some of these costs. For East Africa in particular, I have not followed up on this, but I know in Southern Africa, I've done so in a number of sectors where you get state being taken to court for breach of contract, and then interest payments that would have accrued to the private sector and are required by private sector as reimbursement or payment for breach of contract. And what happens with these investor-state disputes, on the part of government, I've seen there is limited information disclosure on that, because it basically puts a bad picture on them as well. So yeah, this is a critical aspect when we're talking about the cost of PPPs, when a project goes wrong, or when government or any partner then breaches contract, the cost accrued could even go into the millions as well, hundreds of millions as well. And this is quite a lot of money that has been lost from governments as a result of getting into PPPs that are not well thought out, and that they don't have the capacity to continually implement. And you get that on the fiscal aspect of things as well. And then maybe Regina, if I can also respond to Julius, who highlights who pays a lion's share in these PPPs, and as Africa, do we have the required skills to compete with some of the multinationals? So as what Irene highlighted, that private sector injects investment in the form of capital for these projects, right? And then government has to repay back the loan or the investment put plus interest. So in as much as private sector would have gotten into a PPP, remember they've got a profit motive rather when they engage into these arrangements. So they actually acquire some profit from these ventures. That's one. And then do we have the required skills to compete some of the multinationals? So one thing for sure, domestic private sector is growing, but it might not have the capacity financially, human resources wise, as well as the technology as compared to a number of multinationals. And in some of the observations we've highlighted is that multinational actually crowd out domestic private sector. So in as much as we know we've got company X in Uganda that can equally contribute towards construction of a road, it then loses out in terms of competitive and comparative advantage when compared to the multinationals. Thus, you see multinationals coming in, crowding out the domestic private sector. So I think I'll put it there. The capacity is there, but it's limited. Yeah. So I think I'll pack it here. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, for that addition. Hilda, you there? Hilda is a statistician and researcher who holds a bachelor's degree in statistics from Makerere University and currently pursuing her master's degree in economic policy management. She has been involved in conducting research, advocating for the rights of young people, especially the poor and marginalized, and participating in capacity building of civil society organizations, as well as parliamentarians in data and budget analysis to ensure debt sustainability and child-responsive budgeting in Uganda. Hilda, you're welcome. 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Regina, and the previous speakers. I'm Hilda Tumuhe. I work with Uganda Debt Network. I'll not share the video because my network is on and off. So allow me to give my perspective of the market instruments in the Ugandan perspective. I'll start with the PPPs. Thank you, Adrian, for the broad presentation and clarity on the PPPs. Uganda, for, let me get my presentation a moment. Where is it? Okay. By the end of 2020, none of the PPP projects entered into enchantment before the PPP Act of 2015 had breached a financial clause. So therefore, there is no exposed financial commitments and any contingent liabilities on these projects. However, we cannot forget that Uganda had entered into a number of PPP projects before the PPP Act of 2015. These include the About 8, the Bujagali Hydropower Project, the ESCOM, the Umeme, the Kalangala. But to be specific, I'll elaborate on one. That is the PPP Uganda entered into for the development of the industrial park in Mbale early last year, whereby there are very many issues highlighted in this project. According to the Auditor General's report for June 2020, as at February 2021, it's highlighted that government committed to exempt income tax for income generated from agro-processing and indefinitely carry forward losses and exemption from 6% withholding tax on this project. Uganda committed to take on all the losses incurred by this project, incurred by the consultant, by the investor in the construction of the industrial park in Mbale. So what is the fiscal implication of this? You realize that the government is pushing on a lot of taxes on the citizens of Uganda, but it is exempting investors from this. Will not help Uganda at all, especially in the raising the local revenues to help us boost the debt. We noticed that Uganda's debt has been growing gradually and has even surpassed the 50% threshold of debt to GDP, especially during this COVID-19 period. So if government of Uganda engages into these public-private partnerships, we expect to get a lot of gains from them, especially employing many citizens. But then if Uganda has engaged into this private partnership, but in the agreement, they don't clearly specify the terms of monitoring of the project. They have not clearly specified the terms and conditions. Sometimes Parliament is even left out, especially, for example, like Adrian noted on the Lubova project, where Parliament was not even consulted in the acquisition of this private partnership. The same applies to this other private partnership on the industrial park. The Auditor General notes that project, they did consult Parliament itself, which has an oversight role of approving some of these projects. Then I would like to also talk about the escalating domestic debt. We noticed that Uganda has run into borrowing, especially for this previous financial year, to combat the spread of COVID-19. Uganda acquired a very huge amount of money to combat this spread. whereby we see Uganda running to the domestic market to borrow through the treasury bills and bonds. This has a very big implication on our budget. In the financial 2020, this current financial 2021-2022, a very huge chunk of money will go to debt refinancing, but to be specific, domestic debt refinancing, whereby 6.5 trillion of the entire budget is going to debt refinancing. But then versus the little shares that are going to social sectors like health, education, this increasing, we continue seeing the debt taking on a lion's share of the budget every year compared to these other sectors for the provision of providing social services in the community. But to be specific, when you look at the domestic borrowing, Uganda specifically uses instruments like the bills and bonds. Uganda's market is largely dominated by the bonds, but then we cannot oversee the other bills that are growing on year by year. The bills are short-term, as Adrian highlighted. They're short-term in nature. They range from 91 days to about 36 days. When Uganda acquires more money from the domestic market as bills, it implies that most of Uganda's debt will mature in a short period of time. So this will have a very serious implication on the budget figures in the short run. Therefore, having a very negative implication on the budget as compared to when you look at service delivery versus the taxes. We see a lot of taxes being imposed on the citizens, especially in this COVID-19 era, due to the high debt rollover, whereby a very big chunk is going to debt rollover, but then the service delivery remains a big issue. Then I'll also talk about the other bit, that is the external debt, whereby we see it is also growing. Currently, Uganda's debt as at June 2021 has grown to about 19.46 trillion. This is due to, it is due to the desire of government to combat the spread and also finance the ongoing development projects, especially in the infrastructure side. But then there's a very important point to highlight on the external debt, whereby we see there's a shift from borrowing from the traditional lenders. Those are the multilaterals and bilaterals, but then we go to the bilateral lenders. Those are the commercial, the shift from the multilaterals and bilaterals, then we go to the commercial loans to finance the huge infrastructure development. This has also had a very serious implication on the lenders' debt, because we are tending to debt distress again. When you look at the growing debt versus service delivery, you notice that Uganda is investing a lot of money in paying back debt. Yes, we are not calling upon government to default from its debt, but then if we limit borrowing, or if we look at other options of borrowing rather than commercial banks, whereby there are these other methods, like, say for instance, just as government collected a lot of donations from the public during COVID-19, government could also look at such measures to combat the issue of borrowing at all times in case there is a deficit. There is also domestic revenue mobilization. Right now, we see that there is a lot of untapped into revenue, whereby we are at a level of around 13 to 14% of GDP versus our potential of 18 to about 23% of GDP. This clearly indicates that a lot of revenues have not been tapped into. So if government of Uganda would look at the untapped into revenues, so for instance, looking at these other investors that are being exempted from taxes, and they tap into all these revenues, this would help government to raise money to finance its resources, like to finance its urgent needs. Then yes, I've also talked about the debt repayments and interest payments eating up the biggest chunk of the budget. This is because government has run to borrow from the short-term markets. Those are especially the bills. This has created a very huge burden on government, whereby the debt is going to, the debt will be due in a very short time. Yes, Regina, that's my take.
Thank you, Hilda, for adding your voice to the conversation where you've emphasized the increasing debt in Uganda, the growing debt, of course, the issues around debt rollover, the gap in service delivery, and how giving us options on how we can mitigate issues around debt by increasing or enhancing our revenue potential that we have. I would then like to call upon Ms. Izabela. You're protected. You're protected, and please share your perspective on some of the issues that have been raised and any other issues from the IMF perspective.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to react. So before I venture into talking about the various debt instruments, I just want us to be reminded that what really matters is how the debt is used. And also, you know, what is the way to obtain it in the cheapest way? What is the cheapest way for borrowing of a country? So when we are, you know, of course, the first best is concessional financing, wherever it's possible. When we are thinking about commercial borrowing, what one has to keep in mind always is that a cost-benefit analysis has to be made. Sometimes external borrowing could be cheaper, and it doesn't crowd out the private sector, which is one of the concerns in EAC, but it does come with the foreign exchange risk. So there has to be an analysis at each country level to make these considerations. Of course, when it comes to borrowing in foreign exchange, it is much easier for countries that have revenues in foreign exchange, which is typical for oil exporters. So if there is an exchange rate depreciation, the debt service becomes more expensive, but the revenues are also denominated in that currency. So it becomes a little bit easier. But for what concerns the various instruments, I'm very uneasy when we talk about public-private partnership in terms of debt choices. Public-private partnerships should not be seen as debt instruments. These are contractual agreements we resort to because to facilitate participation of the private sector in government projects, where they have a better expertise, capacity to provide assets, but the more limited borrowing strength. So really, we should resort to PPPs only when these conditions are met. The PPPs entail a risk transfer, but this is a partial risk transfer. Ultimately, the risk is borne by the government, even when it's not explicitly considered in the contract. So imagine, for instance, a highway. In a PPP contract, you would have the two parties share the risks. You know, the government would have the force majeure risk and the exchange rate risk, and the operational risk would be that of the private sector. But what happens when the private company starts to building a highway and then it fails for operational reasons? What happens then? the government still needs a highway. So even if the government doesn't bear that risk, eventually it will have to rebid, select another provider, restart the process, and there are costs involved in this. And these costs always fall back eventually on the government. So we should never think about PPPs as an instrument to hide that, to put that on somebody else's balance sheets, because they are clearly contingent liability for the government. And those rating agencies cannot be fault. They know that. So, I think we have to, consider these instruments. They have potential. They have been instrumental in many countries, but keep in mind the contingent liabilities, present them very transparently, and provision for them in the budgets. So this is what I can say in the moment. Feel free to raise questions. I'm happy to answer.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Izabela, for the clarity. And I saw a comment coming through from Alana that do PPPs really operate in our context, not essentially enable debt to be off the books. Most times government essentially takes all the risk. Okay, maybe Alana, you could
Yes, if you can, I'm not sure I really understand. Maybe Alana, you can specify. What do you mean by that they really operate? Whether they have been, whether we know any success stories, or often the government does resort to this instrument precisely because the debt is very high, and this is a way to postpone that payments, to shift the risk. But then, exactly, it's a risk. It can always it can always come back to the government.
Yeah. Hi, Izabela. I think you're one of the few that has actually essentially pointed out that is this risk that will always come back to the government, because I think the way they are pitched to the populace and the ways in which government does this thing to essentially act like it is not taking on this financial risk at all, right? And we'll have it as a way to really show, like, basically it's often in our context, at least manipulated to be like debt that's off the books. And we've sometimes, and the story is also about how the PPPs end up operating and who ends up paying begin to change, like you see them and the narrative around it. And that's why I think it's, if they came out as transparent and say, listen, these are contingent liabilities, and this is what it will mean for us, and this is the risk we're taking on, and that is different. But in the haste to get PPPs passed, it is often poised as a win-win situation. These guys will give us the money, or we won't really, it's not really government money, or you know what I mean? Like, that is how they spin it. Even with some of the ones that are ridiculous, like Lubova, they still don't, they would not, they don't consider that like, I mean, and Lubova, as the way it's, everything about the way it's structured is ridiculous. And as full disclosure, Isa is litigating a case around this, and the stories about how and who bears the risks have changed from the time we started litigation. And so that's what I was trying to get at, that it is then used to hide.
Well, let me tell you, contracts are always, there are always loopholes that you cannot see into the future. You cannot incorporate all the risks into a contract. But even the ones that you're trying to incorporate, you may be wrong. So for instance, the PPP contracts, when you talk about construction of roads, I give that an example. You have you attach to that some revenues that are coming from tolls. Those revenues depend on many things, on economic activities, on the willingness of people to pay or to take the old very bad road that is free. So they're based on some assumption of traffic and willingness to pay that may be wrong or may change over time. So what happens, you have that in the contract, the firm that is supposed to build the highway counts on those revenues to repay the debt. What if this company cannot raise those revenues? You know, the company fails, then the government takes over, or you know, the government doesn't get that revenues. So there is always some risk there, and it is very important that they are transparent and they are clear, and that the government can budget for those risks, that there are some contingencies that it can use if this contract fails, which is not always taken into consideration. Typically, what we recommend countries to have an overarching public-private partnership law that has some goalposts that you know, this law is used across all levels of governments and entities that are able to, that are allowed to negotiate those contracts, so that at least, you know, there is a certain structure when it comes to signing off those agreements. That's something that I don't know whether it exists in all of East African countries, but even when the structure exists, the actual contracts can bear risks just because we don't know the future. There is uncertainty.
Thank you, Ms. Izabela. I think it's something for us to understand. Okay, Alana, yes?
Sorry, can I just respond really quickly to Izabela?
Okay.
I think part of the frustration that has been voiced in this meeting is that while there is this push for this, and ideally a process should be a more sort of critical analysis, balancing, will this be cheaper for us in the long run? Who is best positioned to bear the risk? That doesn't play out practically here. When there's a push, it is happening. Sometimes the push is from the center, from the president, like it was for Lubova. Other times it is from the funders themselves that are insisting. And we end up with projects that are more costly to us. And essentially then what we then deem as hidden debt. And so that's what I think we're trying to underscore. I agree with you the way it works. I just think that with our context, I really don't believe PPPs, at least in the social services, shouldn't even operate at all. You could talk about roads, they may be a bit more sort of, you may have more ability to forecast tolls and so forth, but what happens when it's a hospital? What happens, you know? So all of those things, I think sometimes they're more theoretical than practical in our context as African countries, and they end up costing our governments more.
I think an additional concern is that by not showing transparently all the government's liability, this can contribute to just lowering the debt management effort, because it just seems that there is some fiscal space there that is bigger, but you know, guarantees that can materialize in any point, and then you suddenly have realized that you did not have the fiscal space that you thought you had.
Okay, thank you, Alana and Izabela, for throwing more light on the commodification of public goods, of course, especially the social services, where we feel that this shouldn't be privatized. I know there's another comment coming through from Andrew. What should East African countries do to ensure that both poor external performance and growing external liabilities don't render our economies unattractive for both domestic and foreign investments? Anyone is free to chip in, the panelists, to share your perspective on that. And another question is, who exactly signs for these agreements and how long do they take for them to review? Julius also says that he hopes that we have some MPs on the platform and they're taking notes. No, we don't have, but we will share. Of course, the plan is to share some of these outcomes with them. Any panelists who want to come on board to share their perspective on the questions that have been raised, and any participants, in case you want to raise, guess you want to ask, please raise your hand. We'll pick on you. Adrian? Irene?
Yes, Regina. So there's a question from Andrew. I'm not sure I understood it well, but I think some of the things, okay, what should East Africa states do to ensure both poor external performance and growing external liabilities don't render the economy unattractive? So I don't know, we've all, I think, heard of the race to the bottom. And I know SEATINI has, in the past, not really, a few weeks ago, I think we were having a discussion on harmonization of tax policies within East Africa. So I think we have very nationally, their taxes or their tax policies that are really diverse from each other, from the different countries. And whenever we are talking about regional integration, then how do we ensure that even our fiscal policies are, a little bit aligned such that one country is not disadvantaged or does not lose out on even foreign direct investment simply because of the tax or fiscal policies that in a country? Then I think for me, some of the things that we should put in place, there are a lot of things that could attract foreign direct investment, or even when we're talking about issues of debt or financing, there are a lot of factors that could attract that, but trying to have or competing tax competition between countries, I don't think it's one of the things. But if you streamline your economy pretty well, you have very transparent and accountable measures within governments, then you are likely to attract a lot of investment and also support from even international financial institutions that can support growth within the economy, and not necessarily having to do or to smear each other or the different partner states that we have just to get some of these benefits from the international parade. So I don't know if I got that question well, but for me, I think some of the things that we need to put in place are proper mechanisms just to ensure that our policies are not very far from each other, because you're talking about regional integration. If at all that is something that you want to move forward with, which for me will be a good thing, but also just ensuring internally you have very proper transparency and accountability mechanisms, even within the different infrastructures or development projects that we are looking at. Yeah, thank you, Regina.
Okay, thank you, Irene. We have a hand from Robert. Robert, over to you.
Thank you so much, Regina. And I want to really thank our panelists for the insightful engagements. Yes, my name is Robert. I'm from the Environment Shield. I want to comment about two things. One, first of all, to underscore what the previous speaker has just talked about, the need for harmonization, in the East African region, harmonization of policies, harmonization of project roadmaps, and harmonization of, for example, issues that we are struggling with, for example, issues of, common market, issues of currency and all that. So you realize that while there's a push for, for political integration through the East African Legislative Assembly, through the East African Summit, headed by the presidents, but there's need for that integration at the level of the economy. Of course, we appreciate the fact that we are different economies, but look at, for example, Kenya, looking at the GDP vis-a-vis, for example, Uganda and other East African states. There's a difference, but I want you to look at a situation like where the standard gauge railway, if I'm talking about, for example, infrastructure development, the standard gauge railway was launched, but the Kenya, Tanzania, moving far ahead of us. For example, here in Uganda, literally no work has been done. You've been seeing the issue of the pipeline. So I think there's that need, for us to have a deliberate, attempt to harmonize, our project roadmaps, so that we are all moving at least the same direction. But short of that, as we push for all these, issues, there will always be some bit of challenges here and there because of we seem to be as a region, we seem to be giving different priorities at a country level, yet we are supposed to be deliberately moving the same direction as far as project prioritization is concerned. Secondly, I also want to ask our panelists, what happens to the issue of the public trust doctrine? Because as Alana ably highlighted on the issue, for example, like here in Uganda, about the issue of Lubova Hospital, where you find that, at the end of the day, once ISA went to court and they saw that there was a legal onslaught, now there was a bit of, finger pointing, trying to shift blame. So we know that as citizens of the East African region, we know that the buck stops with our governments, because you see the government is acting in the public trust of the people, the citizens. They are borrowing all these huge sums of money. You are talking about over 19 point something trillions, for example, for the Ugandan case, literally hovering over the debt ceiling. So what happens in that case for us as citizens? And I would want really one of the panelists to highlight, what do we do as citizens? Is there a way, we can criminally, hold liable, the government, because they borrow money for on behalf of the people, but that money does not play the role that money is borrowed for. And at the end of the day, it is us, the people, the citizens, who end up, you saw, for example, in our budget, dear moderator, our budget recently, the money we have allocated to debt repayment is only going to pay interests, not really to pay even the debt, but to pay the interest. So they borrow huge sums of money with high interest rates, with very, very shabby, agreements that have, clauses that don't favor the Ugandan people, but have those issues like, for example, subsidies, and so the ordinary citizen, the taxpayer, is the one who makes up, bearing the burden, of this debt burden. So what do we do as citizens? Is there a way how we can, hold these people? Forget about these civil actions, criminal liability, where we can actually take on these people, because whatever they are doing, they really are doing it for on behalf of the citizens. So for me, that's my concern about the whole concept of the public trust, where we feel as citizens the trust that we've given to the government, because the social contract arrangement is to the effect that the government is representing the interests of the people. But what happens when such a kind of trust has been abused? So that's my concern. Once again, thank you so much. This is a very good engagement, and we hope to continue carrying it on. Thank you. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you, Robert, for emphasizing the need for government to live by the books or what they've committed, and the fact that once trust is broken, it's always hard to gain it. But these are some of the conversations that maybe our panelists, as they conclude, they want to speak to. You could share your insights on responding to Robert, but also broadly what you want to see going forward. Thank you. I'll start with Adrian.
All right, thanks for that. So I'll start by responding to Andrew's question as I wrap up as well. So there is an issue of attracting foreign direct investment there. And I think it's Irene who highlighted the challenge that we have as a result of a race to the bottom, thereby needing African countries, or the East African region, needing harmonization. The speaker had highlighted, let's focus on economic harmonization more than political. But I'm of the view, I'm actually of the view that political harmonization is actually critical to then the overall harmonization, in which we then make our economies competitive and comparative as well. Because there is this concept of the ease of doing business that is promoted by the World Bank. I think for those who would know that there are a couple of reports, I think should be 2020 or 2019, and going 5 years back, that were recalled because of biases, all right? And I can give an example for Rwanda, which is probably the good child of Africa when it comes to the ease of doing business. And it's problematic in that it then sets already one country ahead of the other or against the other. That's why you will see when we're talking about FDI, there are countries that are said to attract more FDI than others, but yet they're in the same region. And for some, they don't even have the economic means to get that much investment. So that's one thing that I think there is a need for political unison amongst the countries within the East Africa region. That way economic, and this should be also probably on a political ideology, a uniform political ideology, because once we say Tanzania and maybe Kenya are talking about Pan-Africanism, Rwanda is talking about capitalism, then there is a mismatch already. So in terms of economic integration, we could have challenges there. So I don't know how I'll put it, but political integration is as equal. If we are to then say economically and attracting FDI, we have to have some form of uniformity. So yeah, I think I'll pack it there, because then it's the global political economy that controls how investment gets to be in country X and not Y, and why one is to be ranked maybe 69 out of 280 or something like that, when the other is at 188, that kind of thing. Right. And then in terms of how we hold our government's accountability, I think we do have a broken social contract between citizens and our respective governments, either in East Africa or the African continent as it is, because you see there are persons, especially politically exposed persons, who are above the law. So that then implies that we don't have strong institutions. I think strong institutions are key on mostly all governance aspects of any country's livelihood, rather. So if we can have strong institutions that govern borrowing, right, loan contraction, that's one good thing. But also we need also strong institutions on the judicial side of things. Yeah, I'm talking about the courts, the police, and also state security institutions as well, because those sometimes actually back governments. That's why we see rogue decisions being made. So I think for this one, I'll pack it here, but maybe as a parting shot, I think what's critical is actually clear policies, strong institutions, and also the role of citizens in playing a watchdog role on what's happening within their respective countries, because the citizen aspect or the citizen manifesto is something we can't do away with, because remember, in some countries, the citizens are the ones that vote in the governments that then go on to contract odious or not well thought out law. So I think I'll pack it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Over to Ms. Izabela.
Hi, sorry for the delay. I don't have any other comments at this point. Feel free to pass my intervention.
Okay, we can hardly hear you. Izabela, I think we missed you.
Thank you. No, I don't have any comments at this point. Please feel free to pass me.
Okay. Any parting shots from Hilda?
Okay. Thank you, Regina. I think I will just respond to the bit of citizens holding government accountable. And when you look at the Ugandan context, it is with the citizens that vote the leaders into power. So we have the right to vote someone. But then when you look at the projects, especially the loan fund projects, yes, we've entrusted government to borrow on behalf. But then we citizens also have a very big role to play, especially with these loan-funded projects. So for instance, like if government borrows and constructs a road, we as the citizens, have we taken our part to do like what we are supposed to do? So for instance, you find a citizen vandalizing security lights along a road, driving along pavements. We as consumers of public goods, how have we handled the loan-funded projects in place? Because when I drive on a pavement, it implies that this road is going to get worn out in a very short time. So it implies that government will need to incur an extra cost of repairs for these roads. And when you look at our economy, you notice that we don't have money at hand. Then government will run back to borrow. Then the other issue is if we hold our leaders accountable. Say for instance, you have to monitor the implementation of this project. At least to an extent, government has been a bit transparent, especially the Ministry of Finance, whereby at least some information is available for citizens. Citizens have a role of monitoring this project. So I, Hilda, maybe in a given constituency, if I see they are constructing this road, but then they're not constructing it in a proper way, I need to tell maybe my MP, I'm like, there is a fault here and there. Then there is another issue of citizens, how can I state it? Like citizens think it is government's business. Yet they also have a very important role to play in the implementation of these points. Then we have also civil society, whereby citizens, we always reach out to various communities, asking them various issues about loan-funded projects, and then the PPPs as well. So I wish citizens were very open on issues of loan-funded projects, such that they can, because some of these organizations have a better voice, they can amplify these issues to the national level such that they are sorted. Then there is another issue that is really crippling up the community, that is corruption, whereby you find that there's a lot of corruption when this money is acquired. A very big tranche is wasted in corruption. But then who involves in corruption? It is me and you. So it starts with me and you to change this perspective. If you're a government worker, then the public has entrusted you with the authority, maybe to be in the Ministry of Works and all that, and these other ministries. Are you going to be exemplary to the community, or you're also going to rob the nation? So it begins with me and you. Let's all stand up, let's monitor our projects, because these are money and we are going to pay back. So if we don't have these projects, the pinch will still come on us. Back to you, Regina.
Thank you, Hilda. Unfortunately, my internet went off. I'd like to call upon Irene, who will also officially close the meeting since we are part of the organizers. Irene, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if that is Grace or Regina. Huh? Okay. So I think we've had quite discussion that has elicited some things that you want to take forth. But for me, first I'll begin with a bit of parting shot before I even talk about the closing. But I think we've discussed at length some of the things that are troublesome or give us a bit of things to think about when you're talking about economic accountability. But I look at economic accountability issues as quite requiring a bit of expertise. It's not really, I know we're referred to as experts, but personally, I'm not an expert. There are things I learn every day. And I think even as we're looking at our different government institutions, the national treasuries, yes, they have expertise, but I think there is need to just, for proper capacity building within these institutions, so that whenever we're talking about issues of debt restructuring or Eurobond restructuring, then at least there is that expertise within our individual government institutions just to be able to, to make proper decisions. And as Izabela said earlier, there's a lot of thinking that goes into it. It's not simply about getting debt, but how is that debt even sustainable for a different partner state or this partner state? What are some of the risks? What are the borrowing terms? Is it cost effective? There's so many things to consider. So I think capacity building within our different institutions is also key to consider. But at now citizen or the public's level, I think there is an aspect that has largely been forgotten or ignored. It's not actually forgotten. I think it's deliberately ignored by our different government institutions, the aspect of public participation, you see. So we have all these things that, we just hear, a Eurobond was procured or something came into being that eventually will affect you and me as a citizen. We are the people that are supposed to pay taxes to ensure proper revenue mobilization to repay some of these debt instruments that have been procured. But have we been involved in that procurement? Was there transparency even discussion as we want to put up or down in this area? How has that reflected? How has the public participated? So I think, and I wish we had even some members of parliament or even policymakers amongst us, just to emphasize the issue of public participation. It is important to involve the public when you're doing something about the public. So you might put up a hospital, but they didn't need a hospital. Probably they needed something else more. They need a school more, but you went ahead and just put up a hospital without even involving the public. So I think that is also key. And I can't emphasize enough the issue of transparency and accountability and just the role even civil society institutions play to just give the rights holders information to be able to hold duty bearers to account. Sometimes people are not really ignorant, just that they don't know some of these things, how they exist or how they come to be. So it's a call upon us, individuals, academia, within the academia, working on issues of economic accountability or public finance management. It's upon all of us, to ensure that there is enough capacity or awareness within the public to just be able to engage in these issues. And on to the closing now. I know I'm standing between us and lunch, but just really quickly is to thank SEATINI and all the organizing partners. We thank UDN, we thank AFRODAD for this session. Thank you very much, Adrian. That was quite an informative presentation that you did earlier. So and also just to call upon all of us, to move the discussions beyond just discussing it here amongst people who already know, and also take the discussion further to policymakers, take the discussion further to even write about it. Academia, I'm glad that we have at least a representative from the academia here. What are we doing beyond just, talking about these issues? Have we written about them? Have we done petitions about these issues to the different parliaments? Have we engaged the East African Legislative Assembly on such issues? So there is a lot to do, but I'm glad that this is part of the beginning. And on that note, thank you very much, SEATINI, for bringing us together to discuss, to have this important discussion. Thank you. We also thank the international financial institutions that have been represented here. I know there's a lot that sometimes we might clash, sort of, but we are all driving towards the same agenda. And finally, I think we couldn't be able to gather here today without the support of our donor, Diaconia. So thank you very much for the support. And we look forward to continue engaging this even beyond, even on social media. When we meet, when you have different discussions, do we point out some of these issues, or it's just discussed here and that is the end? So that is a challenge to all of us, to take the discussion further and to engage even beyond just this platform. So Regina or Grace, thank you very much. To the ED SEATINI, asante sana. In Kenya, we say asante sana, Jenna Lunga, for being part of this as well, and to your team. So thank you. Adrian, pass our regards to the AFRODAD team. Thank you. Grace?
Thank you. Thank you, Irene, and thank you, everyone. And a special thank you to Izabela for taking off time to take part in this fully. Thank you all, and we wish you a very good afternoon. Have a good evening and the rest of the afternoon, and enjoy your lunch. Bye.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you all. Thanks for making it. Have a good afternoon. Nice lunch.